Good morning. We started last week talking about the book of Esther as kind of a bridge, not thematically, but just as a matter of convenience, as a bridge to the talking about Christian character sometime in the upcoming several weeks here. But Esther is a useful book. For one, as it happens, it is a book about character in a lot of ways, but more fundamentally, it has some interesting lessons in it in a relatively self-contained and not too long of a story. So that's frankly the practicalities of why I chose to take a study at it. I'm not sure that's a correct phrase to say there, but anyway. Yesterday we talked about the sort of got introduced to Ahasuerus, who is the king of Persia, who I incorrectly introduced as Artaxerxes, although in fairness that is because the Septuagint, I finally was able to sort all this out over this past week. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, actually translates it as Artaxerxes, and it shows up that way in some translations, particularly in the King James, which relied heavily on the Septuagint, and several other ones that I grew up with. And so even though my more recent materials were saying Xerxes, I wasn't really paying attention. But the consensus generally is that Ahasuerus is actually Xerxes, who was the king that succeeded Darius the Mede, who was the king that succeeded Cyrus, who was the one who allowed the Jews to go back into Canaan. Xerxes would have ascended the throne in about 486 BC and reigned until about 465. So hopefully puts that in a little bit of a historical context. But in any event, what we looked at was Ahasuerus' Queen Vashti, the feasts and the celebration that he gave, and then when he and his nobles and everyone had become merry with wine, as opposed to what we might say today, which would be falling down drunk maybe, he decided he wanted his queen to come in so he could show her off because she was beautiful. She didn't want to come in. The king essentially consulted with his wise men, and they said, fire her. I don't know if there's any more, better way to say it than that. Basically, fire her as queen, which on one level at least she kind of got off lucky, because it was not atypical for the kings of Persia to kill people who displeased them, so at least that didn't happen to her. But in any event, once she got fired from the job of being queen, we're going to pick up in chapter 2 and find out that the king feels, lonely or something like that, and he decides he needs a new queen. And so we're going to look at the process by which Ahasuerus got himself a new queen. Now, I handed out worksheets last Sunday. I know you don't have one because you weren't here last Sunday, I'm certain of that. Anybody else not have a worksheet from last week? A few more copies left. You don't have to show me if you do, Jerry. I'll just take your word for it. But, okay, so I apologize again for the small type. It was a PDF form. For some reason, I didn't save the Word version of it, and so I don't have the ability to change the font size because my PDF, my version of Acrobat can't convert back to a Word document. So, get your magnifying glasses out. But you'll see as we go through this worksheet is not... It's not going to go through and ask you, what happened in chapter 1, what happened in chapter 2. It's not that kind of a worksheet. This is focused more on trying to understand the themes and ideas of Esther. And so while it does kind of break down chronologically, some of the questions are questions that encompass the whole book as we go along. And so about the first 5 questions deal, for the most part, with the stuff we're going to look at today in chapter 2. But one of the questions that's kind of interesting, and one of the things that's kind of interesting to notice, and I don't know how many of you were aware of this before you went into this study, but the name of God and references to the Lord are completely absent from the book of Esther, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the only book in the Bible that's true of, that there's no reference to any of the Godheads. Now,
you're not mistaken.
I'm not, okay, good.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's what I had thought as well. So the book of Esther is the only place where you don't see the name of God. Does that bother anybody? Does that seem weird to anybody? Not really? Okay. I mean, it doesn't bother me. It does seem a little weird to me. And I suspect that it was a matter of some discussion at the council that ultimately determined to include Esther in the canon, because it is unusual in that it does not specifically mention God. Now, the presence of God is felt throughout the book. I don't think there's any real doubt about that, but the fact that it doesn't mention him at all is somewhat unusual. And in part, and I will tell you from the knowledge I have of this would have been the late, or the early church, or by this time the early Catholic Church Council that set the biblical canon. Part of the reason that they adopted books like Esther as well as Song of Solomon, which is another one you sometimes wonder, why in the world is this in here, was because they were part of the Jewish canon. The Jews accepted them as being accurate, and they were included in the Jewish canon. For the most part, the council the church council that made the decisions about this accepted the Jewish canon as it was. Now there were parts of the Jewish canon that were considered even by the Jews to be what we would think of as, what's the word I'm looking for here? What's that? Apocryphal, yes, thank you. As being apocryphal, and even within the Jewish canon, they were not universally accepted. Those were left out. But as far as the ones that were traditionally accepted, Esther was one of them that was kept in, even though, as I said, even though it doesn't have God's name in it specifically. So it's a little unusual in that regard. But where do we see examples in the book of Esther? I realize you may not have read the whole book yet, but I'm guessing, I could be wrong, but I'm guessing most of you are at least vaguely familiar with the story. So give me some of your memories of where you see the hand of God or the providence of God in the story of Esther. I realize we're jumping and I'm doing some spoilers here, but that's okay. Jerry?
The reference, I think, to, what's his name? Not Mordecai, the other guy.
Haman?
Cain, yeah. He says that you don't know if he tells Esther that you don't know if you're here for that purpose.
That was Mordecai.
Mordecai.
You're right in your first instinct, yeah. So, okay. So he actually talks about the idea that you don't know what, that there's a purpose. You don't know exactly when your purpose comes up, but you have a purpose. Okay? What else? Where else do we see the providence of God in the story of Esther?
I think just the fact that she wins.
Okay. What do you mean you say wins?
Wins that she becomes queen.
Okay, becomes queen, because there's two different senses of victory. So,
Yeah.
okay, she becomes queen. Ken?
The way at the end of the story that the Jews are providentially allowed to defend themselves,
Okay.
I think shows the hand of God.
Okay.
The writing of that, the reissuing of that decree.
Okay. So they are the fact that they are given a victory at the end of the book. Anybody else? Any other thoughts on this? And that's okay if you don't have any more thoughts. That may be kind of all that there are, but I suspect what we'll find as we go through this is that we see more of those. So we'll keep coming back to this question as we go along because it's worth exploring.
If you say it, if you answer too long, I got a whole bunch of others.
That's right.
Definitely spoilers.
It's in the spoiler things. So we'll kind of watch for these as we go along through this aspect of the book of Esther. Now, the hero or heroine of the book of Esther, who would you say is the I don't like the terms hero and heroine. Those are kind of fallen out of favor. Protagonist has become the more popular one. Who would you say the protagonist of the book of Esther is? Mordecai. So Linda would say Mordecai, and I certainly think that he is as valid an answer as anybody. The other dominant alternative is who? Esther. And I think both of them, you can have more than one protagonist in a story, and I think both of them are. It's easy to pick the antagonist because Haman definitely is cast in that particular role, and everybody else is pretty much supporting characters. Even the king, in many ways, is a supporting character for the rest of the story. So as we go through this, we see that Mordecai, in many ways, is more of a moving force in the story than Esther is, really. There's a degree to which, for a lot of what she does, Esther has things happen around her. And there's only a couple of places where she actually does things. And of course, they're very important things, but nevertheless, Mordecai tends to be more of the one who's pushing things forward and telling her what to do even. And so there's definitely a significant role that he plays in the overall story here. So.
Yeah, because I don't even know that Esther would have done some of those things if it hadn't been for him. She was doing what he told her to.
Yeah.
Because she didn't necessarily want to go into the kingdom or something.
Yes, definitely. And so we see actually there's a number of places, we'll see this even just in the very first part of this, in the second chapter, where Mordecai on several occasions tells her what to do.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting to me that one of the main reasons that Mordecai is so important takes place before this story ever happened.
That's true. We'll see that in the second chapter as well. So yes, it is actually, at the end of chapter 2. So, okay. All right, so one of the things I want you to pay attention to, if you notice the sixth question there is, list the banquets that we read about in Esther, and that seems like sort of a trivial question, but it's fascinating to see just how many banquets there are. So up to this point, we've already had two. In chapter 1, verse 3, we had a banquet that the king gave that apparently lasted for months. And then in chapter 1, verse 5, a second banquet that he gave specifically for the people living in the citadel at Susa. And as we go on, just kind of keep your eye open for additional banquets that we encounter. And we'll talk about why that's significant, if it is significant, as we get toward the end of the study rather than right now. So, okay. So, I would like to get somebody to read for me Esther chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. Probably not Ken, because I think he might die if I had him do it right this minute. So, somebody else, chapter 2, verses 1 through 4.
After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so.
Okay, so right off the bat, what would we call this in our modern era? What would we call this sort of a thing?
Beauty contest.
Beauty contest, basically, yeah. It's a very elaborate and complicated beauty contest, basically. Now, it's interesting because this speaks to, you know, when he goes and he asks the young men and to their opinion, the young men and his advisors, I'm reminded of the story of Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, who when he was made king, and the people came to him and said, the burden of taxation and labor that your father Solomon put on us was too great. We ask that you would lift that burden somewhat. And he went and sought counsel, and he got counsel from the older men who said, tell them you'll do what they want and try to work with them. And he went to the young men, and the young men said, you're king, do whatever you want to and tell them you're going to make it worse. And the king said, I like what the young men are saying. That sounds more like what the king gets to do. It, you know, I'm the king, I'm in charge, and I can do what I want to. And of course, the result was that 10 out of the 12 tribes revolted against him and ended up with the split kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Here, the king goes to the young men, and the answer the young men give him is exactly the sort of thing you might expect a bunch of young men to come up with, which is bring in all the good-looking women and let's take a look and see. You know, I mean, that's very much kind of a young men kind of thinking there. Why would this appeal to the king? Beyond the extremely obvious of getting to choose his bride from among all the prettiest women, why would this appeal to the king?
In one way, it would be like a trophy wife, a trophy queen.
Okay, so there's an element of a true, I mean, really is a trophy kind of a thing where you're getting to choose from all of the most beautiful young women. Okay, what else? Go ahead.
He's replacing somebody that was, I guess, very beautiful because he wanted to parade her in front of her.
Okay.
So, he's wanted to do the same thing again.
Okay, so clearly Vashti was beautiful because that's why he wanted to bring her out. And so he wants to make sure he replaces her with someone who, I guess, lives up to that standard or something like that. Ken?
Since it is to be drawn, since the women are to be drawn from throughout the kingdom, it is a way to curry favor, if you will, or to involve all of the people in the nation and make them see what the king is like, and a very democratic process in one sense that any girl in the kingdom that's beautiful has a chance at this.
Okay, so there is a sense in which it's sort of an outreach to the various nationalities and groups that make up the kingdom, which by this time is a lot of different groups because of the size of the Persian Empire. And so there's a degree to which perhaps this is an opportunity to improve his standing in their eyes, perhaps even improve political ties to some extent across his kingdom. Anybody else? Any other thoughts on this? Eva?
Maybe he's thinking of the future of his kingdom and then sons and daughters, what they would look like maybe.
Okay? So he wants to have good-looking kids. I mean, that seems reasonable. And he needs to have heirs also. I mean, just on a fundamental level, that's one of the reasons he needs a queen, is so that he can have heirs. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think that the king had a domestic problem that probably reflected in his political persona, because Vashti was confronted and didn't do what he asked.
Okay.
Which is not typical of that era.
And actually, if we go back and look at chapter 1, something we looked at last week, there was a concern that her example might lead to a broader rebellion of wives against their husbands. And so there may have been an element of concern that we need somebody that we can bring in as a model of doing things the right way. That may have been an element of it in this whole process. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? There's no wrong answer to this. We're all kind of guessing what this guy's motivations were. So, Ian.
There's an element of control freak here too.
Okay. I was wondering, I'm sitting here thinking, is nobody else picking up on this? Because, yeah, there's a huge element of control freak here.
Yeah.
Oh, king, bring in all the most beautiful women, and you're the king, you can do whatever you want to, no matter how disruptive or chaotic this might be, and that's basically what's happening here, So there's definitely a degree to which I think this appeals to the king's vanity.
Well, and then to Linda's point about Vashti, who was extremely beautiful, and he wanted to parade her in front of all of his buddies to show how beautiful it was, and she's like, nah, we're not going to do that. He seems to me, again, with the control element of things, wanted to find someone just as beautiful, but a little more controllable.
Okay.
A little more subservient, or a lot more.
Yes. So he's looking for somebody, women who are young for one thing, and so that would seem to be the case, although youth and virginity are kind of going hand in hand in a lot of respects. So there's a certain logic to that regardless, but I think you're absolutely right. I think that there's an element of vanity, and I think there's an element of making sure this is someone he has control over. And one of the things about this kind of a contest, so to speak, is that it demonstrates to any woman that does win, hey, you know what, if you don't do what I want, it's not like there aren't some other options out there, however many hundreds or thousands of them we brought in, if you're not going to do what I want, I can certainly pick one of them and replace you. So there's probably an element of that as well in this process. So, okay, somebody read for me verses 5 through 7 now, please.
Now there was a Jew in Susa, the capital, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jar, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah. Thank you for these.
I'm so glad I can put that
and
in.
Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled, and he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter.
Okay. So, one thing we need to kind of clear up, or there's a point of confusion, at least in some commentaries and some notes, where it says Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives. Now, if that was referring to Mordecai being taken into captivity, he would be like 140 or 180 years old. What it's referring to is that Kish was taken into captivity. His grandfather, actually great-grandfather, I guess it would be, who was actually taken into captivity. The timeline of the captivity was such that by this time, that would have been very problematic if it was Mordecai who had been taken.
The better translation says Kish was taken.
So it actually, how does it read in the King
It
James?
reads, let's see, Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with
okay.
the captives.
So,
And mine even says his family had been among those who with King Jehoiakim of Judah had been exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon.
yeah, so it's the New American Standard and several of the other ones translate it literally in the sense of this is the way the words were arranged, but some of the other translations, like the King James, and I think the NIV does, and I know you have the New Living Translation, I think, they translate it in terms of what the tense means, because of what we know how Hebrew is written. It means what Jerry and Barbara, thank you, my brain just lost it there for a second. What Jerry and Barbara have both pointed out, which is that it's referring to Kish, but because the way the Hebrews write things and the way the American English is written, it doesn't automatically mean that to us. And so that's why I wanted to sort of clarify that. So Mordecai was born in captivity, or born in Persia, and has really never been, almost certainly has never been in Israel at all, unless at some point he visited once the right to return was made. But more than likely, he's lived his entire life in captivity. And so by this time, he is probably very much well versed with the rules and expectations and behaviors of the Persian Empire, which certainly had its own specific way of doing things, but also was relatively willing to allow other religions and other practices, as long as they didn't directly conflict with or create problems for the Persian way of doing things. They were relatively liberal about that stuff because that made it a lot easier. It's a lot harder to run an empire when it's huge and you're trying to tell everybody they have to do exactly the same thing you do, and nobody wants to. That's just asking for rebellion all the time. So,
just a side comment. Jeremiah talks about giving them the instructions to go, when you're in Babylon, marry, make a business, build your home, live in Babylon, and become, he encourages them. And so Mordecai probably is a pretty well-off guy.
Could be. And certainly, when you read in Jeremiah, what God is saying is not intermarry or become part of their society. What he's saying is put down roots. Live there like it's your home, because you're going to be there for a while. And some of you, we talked about this last week, by far the majority of Jews that were in captivity stayed in the Persian Empire and among the Assyrians, and did not return to Jerusalem and Judea during this period of time. It was much later that the majority of them were repatriated from those empires. And so Mordecai is one of many who has remained behind, and there is some indication in here that he was reasonably well off and reasonably successful. But the key thing here is that he's adopted Esther as his, so it says actually that it's his uncle's daughter. So she may not be that much younger than him, as a practical matter, if she is his uncle's daughter. So it's hard to know for sure.
It is hard to know, but I was going to make the comment that in my family, what you said is very true. Her family, there's cousins that are 20 years older than each other.
Right.
It's a huge family.
Yeah, that's why I said possible, but it can be true.
Yeah, because I've got second cousins that were my mother's cousins, but they were the same age as me.
Right. That's not confusing or anything, so.
You can understand why Ken thinks it's really confusing to go to a family.
I imagine so, yeah. You can get a lot of things wrong if you're not paying close attention, so. Anyway, we don't know for sure how much older, but clearly he was old enough to be responsible for her and to raise her, and we're going to see he has the demeanor of someone who's got a lot of wisdom, which is oftentimes associated with age, but not necessarily. Boaz is referred to in the book of Ruth as being very wise, but also being actually no, he was an older man as well, not old, but he was an older man as well. So we don't know for sure, but there's a lot of indication that he may not be super young. So in any event, he is raising her. It's also interesting to see that she has what is almost certainly a Hebrew name, which is that Hadassah, and then she's referred to as Esther. Anybody else get two different names once they went into captivity that you can think of?
Well, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
There we go. Okay, so all of them were renamed by the Babylonians in their case, and it's unclear whether Esther received a name at what point that name would have been given to her. It might have been something that they chose to do that when she was young in order to kind of help her blend in. It might have been something, conceivably, the name that she was given to her once she was actually taken in as part of this beauty pageant process, because that could very well be the case. That was what happened with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as well as with Daniel. So, okay. So Esther is Mordecai's adopted daughter, basically. All right, somebody read for me now verses 8 through 11, please.
So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in the custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her.
Okay, so, who was it who told me yesterday, or last Sunday, about a movie, a dramatized version of Esther where the young women were actually kidnapped? Was that you, kid? What was that production? I forgot.
What was the thing?
Was it a movie about Esther specifically?
Yeah, it
Okay.
was just the story of Esther, and they presented it as these women were forcibly taken into captivity.
And you can read it that way because it talks about them being gathered and, and that kind of thing. But the way that the overall thing is kind of couched, it makes it sound more like it's kind of something that you're wanting to succeed at this. It's not people are being kidnapped and taken off to this, but rather that people are choosing to volunteer and to be known about it. So it's very unlikely that this is that sort of thing. But to be fair, the reality is that when you're exercising absolute authority, there's sometimes it's kind of hard to tell the difference between, you made me do it and you asked me if I wanted to do it. The border gets a little, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, the other thing that I wonder about though is they were not supposed to intermarry, and if they were very devout Jews, to them that would be bad, because when they went in for this, they weren't coming back out. They were just, if they weren't acceptable, they were put in his harem. They weren't allowed to go back out and have families or anything necessarily. They were just there for their life, probably.
It's not made clear, but it does. That's the implication, definitely.
Yeah, and so they just, that's not something a devout Jew, I would think, would want to do. I don't know. It's
tricky, because clearly that was what Mordecai thought was the best idea for Esther, and yet you're right, that they had been commanded not to intermarry, and yet the flip side of that is there are a number of examples in the scriptures where intermarriage was part of the plan of God, and so it always seems a little confusing to me, why you'd have such a hard and fast rule that then you deliberately violate to prove that, hard and fast rules are problematic.
Because there's all kinds of intermarrying in Jesus' life.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So.
Well, Jesus himself says something greater than Sabbath is here.
Yeah.
Well, God has the freedom to overrule or use a violation or a departure from his rules to serve the overall purposes of his kingdom anytime he wants.
That's true.
His thoughts are not ours, and his ways are higher than ours.
That's true. It just leaves us confused sometimes. That's the one downside to it, I think. So, okay, so Esther is taken into the citadel of Susa. She's given to the custody of the chief eunuch, actually. This Haggai is referred to previously as the chief eunuch. And he really likes her. As she, for whatever reason, her personality or whatever it was, he really likes her. So what does he do for her? What are some of the things he does?
Before you leave that, is that perhaps one of these hand of God things that we talked about?
One would think, perhaps, yes. As we're going to see as we go along here, he gives her some advice that turns out to be apparently very helpful too in terms of how to present herself to the king. So I think it's very likely that that was the case, that God is involved in this aspect of it as well. That's a good point. Okay, so what are some of the things he does for her?
Special meeting.
Okay, so he gives her the nicest food, and what else?
Attendance.
He gives her attendance. Why would that be important?
Culture, costumes, decorative adornment.
Okay.
Well, he loaded her down with cosmetics too, so one would think that she's going to need some help putting it all on.
That's probably true. Okay. Jared, what were you starting to say?
I was going to say status, just.
Okay. And all of those things, I think, you've got attendants to help you get ready. You have them to tell you kind of help you navigate the palace. I mean, even if she had become relatively familiar with Persian culture, living in Persia, there's a difference between the culture of your country and the government culture of your country. You know, most of us would be hard pressed to walk into Congress and just start working in a, you know, either in the capacity of a congressman or even as a staff member in one of their offices. We would very quickly find ourselves overwhelmed by the culture and circumstances because we wouldn't know very much about the practicalities of doing that. So having someone to help her, people to help her navigate with that, having people, and I think having attendance is a matter of status itself. Being able to have people with you and working for you is something that gives you a certain inherent worth in the eyes of at least some people. So, Ken?
And at today's lingo, he gave her a penthouse with the best view in the house.
Okay, so he also gave her the nicest or the best place in the harem. I don't know what that means exactly, but whatever it means, it was a good thing. It was something that was a blessing to her and was an advantage for her. So she was given a number of advantages based on Haggai's taking a liking to her, and so ultimately that is success, that is beneficial, and as Ken says, I think almost certainly that is providential, that that's not just an accident, but that's something that God wanted to have happen. Yes, sir.
This is a tangent, but this also speaks to the power of the staff.
Yes.
Because Haggai had a lot of influence on her winning that contest.
Yes. I think anybody who's ever wielded governmental power knows that the staff that work for you can be every bit as important, if not more so, than the person who's making the final decisions a lot of times, because they're the ones that decide, you know, what comes in front of you and some of those kinds of things.
There was an American philosopher, politician, or somebody that by the name of Boss Tweed. Do you know him?
Oh yes, New York politician, no, Chicago, or basically ran Tammany Hall in New York and controlled the politics there.
Correct, and his philosophy was, I don't need to control the election, but I certainly want to control the nomination.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening here. The nomination is being controlled. And the king doesn't have to choose from hundreds.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
He's kind of being presented the ones
He's
that are the
being
most
presented
likely.
the obvious
Yeah.
choices.
And there's a degree to which that is a both a benefit and a curse, right? Because on the one hand, you don't, when you're trying to make an important decision, you really don't want to have to choose between thousands of things most of the time. If you've ever gone on Amazon searching for something and typed in a sort of generic term and gotten 30 pages of basically the same thing with slight variations, that it becomes a curse very quickly when you're trying to decide which one you want. On the other hand, it can be a problem to have someone control it like that, because then they can funnel to you what they want done, and they can control the process from that standpoint. And that can be, again, if they have your best interest at heart, that can be fun. If they don't, that can be very problematic. So, Linda?
I think that he recognized there was something very different about Esther. And I think the fact that Mordecai was trying to ensure that she didn't reveal her Jewish background, but I think he recognized that she was very different probably from the other women, and that's probably how she won his favor too.
It could be. I mean, it could be very comparable to what happened with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in terms of their encounters with the staff in Babylon when they were taken into captivity, and they were initially given choice foods and things that they knew better than to eat, and had to basically do a sort of let us prove it to you contest in order to get things that were healthier for them to eat. But it was recognized very quickly that they were unusual in that regard, and that's why they were given the freedom to do what they did. So that could very well be true, that there's a relationship there. And that kind of brings us into the last thing we're going to talk about today, because we're down to the last, we got about 10 minutes left, but the last aspect of this that I want to talk about a little bit is, it says, Esther did not make known her people or her kindred for Mordred, thinking of the legend of King Arthur all of a sudden, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. Now, why would Mordecai not want her to make her Jewish heritage known?
I think there's some anti-Semitism.
Okay.
So even though they were allowed to practice their own religion and that kind of thing, they were not held in high esteem per se.
Okay. Ken.
Well, ultimately, they were a conquered, captured people living with him. Now, maybe some of the others in the provinces were as well, but they definitely would have had a lower cultural status in Susa and elsewhere in the kingdom.
So, yeah, I think that's true. And they were worse off than most of the people, because most of the other people, their regions where they lived were still intact. They were still living where they lived. The Jews, at least the ones that we're seeing in the book of Esther, are not even coming from their homeland anymore, even though that's a part of the Persian Empire. They've been deported forcibly because of the inability of the Persian, or the Babylonians, to get them to comply with their expectations. So, yeah, I think they would have had a lower cultural status than some. I definitely think there's some anti-Semitic bias going on here. Haman certainly goes from 0 to 1,000 miles an hour on that real fast, and you think maybe there's something more going on than just one guy irritated him and he decided to wipe out an entire race of people. And certainly history has shown that there are very few groups of people as an ethnic or religious group that have been more consistently persecuted than Jews throughout history, for a variety of reasons. But in virtually every place that they've been, they have faced a level of animosity that is extraordinary relative to most of the rest of the people of the world. And and I'm not even talking about the 20th century and some of the things that happened in World War II, and after that, just historically, they have been in dire straits for a lot of their time. So I think there's probably an element of anti-Semitism and a concern that if she is identified as a Jew, that either that may be a factor in the decision-making, or certainly the status of the Jewish people because of the captivity, because of the circumstances, may be a situation. One of the issues with the Jews and Persia is that they would have been one of, if not the only, monotheistic people in that entire empire, just about. And in particular, they would have been one of the very few that would have resisted consistently worshiping, whether it would have been the king or gods the king set up, or golden statues like Daniel and the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got into trouble for. They would have been calling attention to themselves, not on purpose or not desiring to do it, but out of necessity of refusing commands that most people would have gone along with. Because if you're monotheistic, one more god isn't a big deal one way or the other. Yeah, maybe it's not one of the ones you treat. What's that? Sorry. Yes. If you're pluraltheistic or whatever, if you're polytheistic. Yeah. If you're polytheistic, one more god is not going to bother you. Adding one more to the celestial stars or whatever is not going to throw you off that much. Whereas if you're monotheistic, you're not willing to add anything to that, and so that would have called attention to them as well. And certainly that created multiple problems for Daniel throughout his period of time, or his book. So Esther has been commanded not to reveal her family or her people or her kindred. Mordecai says not to do that. Mordecai is keeping track of her. He's walking back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how she was and how she fared. Now, he can't go in, obviously. I assume that's obvious to everyone. Only eunuchs, males, in terms of males, only eunuchs are going to be allowed in there. But she is somehow or the other passing messages. Now, later on, we're going to see that she's passing them through one of the chief eunuch. But at this particular time, we don't really know exactly how the information is coming back and forth. But somewhere or the other, there's information going both directions, because later in the chapter, we're going to see that he passes her messages in terms of plot against the king's life. And obviously, he's being able to find out some stuff about what's going on with her.
This also perhaps speaks to Mordecai's status and connections within the kingdom. That he had the ability to gain that kind of information easily. Yes,
or at least that he was allowed to be hanging around there, because that's not, it's kind of like if you're constantly hanging out in front of the White House, the Secret Service is going to start asking you some questions at some point, and perhaps encourage you to move on for a while before you come back to visit again, because they get nervous about those sorts of things. So, okay, so we're going to stop there.